It took me 9 years to get one of these, and I feel like I should have gotten it sooner. 9 years ago, I got my first camera and I just started filming. It was a Canon 70D. It was my first ever camera that my parents got me, and I got it. I started experimenting a lot with what I was shooting. Being new to the world and just learning about all of the new gear and equipment that you can get, right? You start to overlook the simple things, the easy things that you should get at the very start. Those things actually make a big difference. This is one of those things. What these are basically shades, so they basically darken the image that you put in front of your camera. It's called an ND filter. It stands for neutral density filter. What does it mean by neutral density? It doesn't color your image. So if you put this in front of your lens, it doesn't put a tint of green or a tint of orange into your image, basically. This one that I'm holding is a variable ND. So this one's an old one. The one that I bought recently is the one that I'm using right now on my camera. It's so simple, but it doesn't click in your mind that you actually need this thing, right? So basically, if I turn this thing, you can see the image behind it gets darker. So that's basically what a variable ND does. Although you can get solid ones that have specific darknesses to them, it's such a simple thing that you feel like, I'll never use it, because at the time, I wasn't really shooting stuff that would need it. So fast forward to now, I recently got a new one from KNF. It is an ND2 to ND400 ND filter. It's relatively cheap compared to other accessories that you can get for cameras. The one that I got is a 82mm and it cost me around like 1,000 pesos. So an ND filter is basically an enabler. So what do I mean by that? To figure that out, we have to go back to the basics of cameras or filmmaking. There's something called the exposure triangle, where you have the three things that basically determine your exposure. One is the shutter speed, the ISO, and your aperture, which is from your lens. For films and video, your shutter speed is usually locked to double what your frame rate is. I usually shoot at 24 frames, right? My shutter speed should be at 1/48. But since consumer cameras can't really do increments like that, the closest one is what you usually go to, which is 1/50. So right now I'm shooting at 1/50. Why do we need to shoot at double the frame rate? It's because at double the frame rate, this is where you usually have something called motion blur. The lower the number, meaning below double, the more blur you get. So when I move my hand like this, you can see there's a blur to it, right? If you get a lower number, there's more blur. The higher the number, there's less blur. Naturally to your eye, there's usually a blur to it. So at double the frame rate, that's where it naturally aligns with what your eyes see. Of course, that rule can be broken. Like what I said, you can shoot at a lower shutter speed or a higher shutter speed depending on what you want to do with your film. It's more of a guide than a rule. Next, we have ISO. For ISO, you usually shoot at the lowest that you can use. For example, if you're shooting with Canon or Sony or Nikon, it's usually, especially with the consumer cameras, it's usually 100 ISO. But for my camera with the A63, when I'm using a picture profile that uses logarithmic color profile, it locks the lowest ISO that you can use at 800 ISO, which is the native ISO. Native ISO is basically where your sensor performs at its best in regards to your shadows and your highlights. The noise is uniform throughout your image, or at least that's how I understand it. For aperture, it's usually a preference. So for me right now, I'm shooting at f1.4. Some lenses start at 3.5, especially the kit lenses that you get. It starts at 3.5, some start at f4. My current lens is a Viltrox 23 f1.4, and I usually prefer shooting at the lower apertures because it looks nicer. So one of the reasons why you want to shoot at the lower aperture, or a bigger aperture actually, is that you get more background blur or more blur from what is in focus. With f1.4, you're exposing your sensor to a lot more light. If you can imagine what I'm shooting at right now, I'm at a shutter speed of 1/50, ISO 800 at f1.4, so it would be extremely bright. So if I didn't have an ND filter, I'd have to compensate in some other way. So for example, I can increase the shutter speed. I would be letting go of my motion blur. Another way would be for me to increase my aperture, so I would lose my background blur. The ND filter is an enabler in the sense that it enables you to use the settings that you actually want without having to compromise on your exposure triangle. I don't know why it took me 9 years to get a decent ND filter. I got this one. The one I'm holding right now is an old one. It's from Photasy. I didn't really like it at the time because it would give an X at the max, and it wasn't really that amazing of an ND filter. And another thing why I held off, because I mostly shoot indoors. I shoot in studio settings where I can control the lights, I can control what's in frame and stuff like that. Recently, I've been shooting a lot more videos, especially in Oasis, with uncontrollable lights, meaning it's one brightness and it's usually at max brightness, and I can't really control what that does basically. When I have those practical lights in the background where I can't control them, I usually expose my talent with a very powerful light, and then I balance it that way so that I can use an ND filter to balance out either my practicals or my talent. I'm really amazed at this ND filter that I'm using. It's the KNF Concept Variable ND. Personally, I can't wait to shoot with it more, especially with outdoor gimbal shots. I think it's one of those things that when you get like a fast lens, it's usually a 50mm f1.8. Should get one of these next. It enables you to shoot videos outdoors with f1.8 without compromising on your exposure triangle. If you guys want to check out the previous video, check it out over here. And if you guys want to subscribe, click over here.